The city was alive with its usual rhythm, cars honking, people chatting, and the distant hum of construction work. Malik walked briskly down the sidewalk, his headphones in, the bass from his music thumping softly in his ears. He was on his way to the library, a place he often went to study or just to escape the noise of his neighborhood. At 22, Malik was focused on his future. He worked part-time at a grocery store and was taking online classes in business management. Life wasn't easy, but he was determined to make something of himself. As he turned the corner onto Maple Street, the sound of shouting caught his attention. He paused, pulling one earbud out. A group of white teenagers, 4 of them, were in the middle of the street, yelling at each other. Their faces were red, their fists clenched. One of them shoved another, and within seconds, punches were flying. Malik hesitated. He didn't know these kids, and getting involved in someone else's drama was the last thing he wanted. But as he watched, the fight escalated. One of the teenagers stumbled and fell, hitting his head on the curb. Blood trickled down his temple, and the others didn't seem to notice or care. They were too busy swinging at each other. "Hey!" Malik shouted, stepping off the sidewalk. "Cut it out, someone's gonna get hurt." The teenagers ignored him, too caught up in their rage. Malik glanced around. A few people had stopped to watch, but no one else was stepping in. He sighed, knowing he couldn't just walk away. He jogged over to the group, dodging a wild punch as he tried to get between them. "Stop," he yelled, grabbing one of the teenagers by the arm. "What's wrong with you? You're gonna kill each other." The teenager he'd grabbed, a tall, lanky kid with a buzz cut, shoved him away. "Mind your own business, man." Malik stumbled but didn't back down. "This is my business when you're fighting in the middle of the street. You think the cops won't show up if someone calls them?" As if on cue, the wail of police sirens cut through the air. Malik froze. The teenagers stopped fighting, their heads snapping toward the sound. For a moment, no one moved. Then, like a switch had been flipped, the teenagers scattered, running in different directions. Malik stood there, his heart pounding, unsure of what to do. The police cars screeched to a halt at the intersection. 4 officers jumped out, their eyes scanning the scene. Malik raised his hands instinctively, a habit he'd learned growing up in a neighborhood where police presence was common. "I was just trying to break up the fight," he said quickly. They ran that way. Before he could finish, one of the officers grabbed him by the arm. "On the ground, now." Malik's eyes widened. "What? No, I didn't do anything, I was trying to help." The officer didn't listen. He forced Malik to his knees, then onto his stomach, pressing his face into the pavement. Malik struggled to breathe, the weight of the officer's knee on his back making it hard to speak. I wasn't," he gasped. Another officer knelt beside him, pulling his arms behind his back. Cold metal cuffs snapped around his wrists. Malik's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd been trying to stop the fight, not start one. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and assault," one of the officers said, hauling Malik to his feet. "Assault?" Malik repeated, his voice shaking. "I didn't assault anyone. Those kids were fighting, and I was trying to stop them." The officer ignored him, shoving him toward the police car. Malik stumbled, his legs weak with fear. He looked around, hoping someone would speak up, but the few people who had gathered were silent. Some were filming on their phones, but no one stepped forward to defend him. As he was pushed into the back of the car, Malik caught a glimpse of the teenagers who had been fighting. They were standing a few blocks away, watching. One of them met his eyes for a split second before looking away. Malik's stomach churned. Why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they telling the police what had really happened? The car door slammed shut, trapping him in the small, suffocating space. Malik leaned his head against the window, his breath fogging up the glass. He felt numb, like this was some kind of nightmare he couldn't wake up from. The ride to the station was a blur. Malik barely registered the streets passing by outside. His mind was stuck on one thought. This isn't fair. He'd done the right thing, and now he was being punished for it. How was that possible? At the station? The officers led him inside and processed him like he was a criminal. They took his fingerprints, his photo, his belongings. Malik answered their questions as best he could, but it didn't seem to matter. They'd already made up their minds about him. "You'll be held here until your arraignment," one of the officers said, leading him to a holding cell. Malik sat on the hard bench, his head in his hands. He thought about his mom, how worried she'd be when he didn't come home. He thought about his little sister, who looked up to him. What would they think when they found out he'd been arrested? Hours passed. Malik's stomach growled, but he didn't dare ask for food. He didn't want to give the officers any reason to treat him worse than they already were. Finally, a guard came to get him. "You've got a visitor," the guard said, unlocking the cell. Malik followed him to a small room where a man in a suit was waiting. He looked to be in his late 30s, with short brown hair and a serious expression. "Malik?" the man asked, standing up. "I'm David Carter. I'm a public defender. I've been assigned to your case." Malik nodded, relief flooding through him. "Thank you. I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to stop a fight." David gestured for him to sit down. "Tell me everything that happened. Start from the beginning." Malik took a deep breath and began to explain. He told David about the fight, about how he'd stepped in to break it up, and about how the police had arrested him instead of the teenagers who had actually been fighting. David listened carefully, taking notes. "This is a tough situation," David said when Malik finished. "The police report says you were the aggressor. They're claiming you started the fight and assaulted one of the teenagers." "That's not true," Malik said, his voice rising. "They're lying." "I believe you," David said quickly. "But without witnesses to back up your story, it's going to be hard to prove." Malik's heart sank. What about the people who were watching? Someone must have seen what happened. "We'll try to find them," David said. "But for now, we need to focus on your arraignment. You'll go before a judge, and they'll decide whether to set bail. I'll do everything I can to get you out of here, but you need to be prepared for the possibility that you might have to stay in custody until the trial." Malik nodded, though the thought of spending more time in jail made him feel sick. "What happens if I'm convicted?" David hesitated. "If you're convicted of assault, you could face up to a year in jail, but we're not going to let that happen. We'll fight this, Malik. You're not alone." Malik wanted to believe him, but the fear in his chest wouldn't go away. He'd always known the world wasn't fair, but he'd never imagined it could be this unfair. The next morning, Malik was escorted to the courthouse for his arraignment. His hands were cuffed in front of him, and the cold metal bit into his wrists as he shuffled into the courtroom. The room was small and sterile, with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything feel even more oppressive. Malik's eyes darted around, taking in the judge sitting high on the bench, the prosecutor at a table to the side, and a handful of people scattered in the gallery. He didn't see his mom or sister, and his heart ached at the thought of them worrying about him. David was already there, waiting for him. He gave Malik a small, reassuring nod as the officers led him to the defendant's table. Malik sat down, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. He felt like everyone in the room was staring at him, judging him, even though he knew most of them probably didn't care who he was or why he was there. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair and glasses, called the court to order. Case number 2047, the State versus Malik Johnson. Charges: disorderly conduct and assault. How does the defendant plead? David stood up. "Your Honor, my client pleads not guilty to all charges." The judge nodded and turned to the prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and an even sharper expression. "Mr. Thompson, does the state have a recommendation for bail?" The prosecutor stood, smoothing his tie. "Your Honor, given the violent nature of the charges and the defendant's lack of ties to the community, we recommend bail be set at $50,000. Malik's stomach dropped. $50,000? There was no way his family could afford that. He looked at David, hoping he would say something, do something. David stood again, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, my client is a lifelong resident of this city. He has no prior criminal record, and he poses no flight risk. He was simply trying to de-escalate a fight when he was wrongfully arrested. We request that bail be set at a reasonable amount, or that he be released on his own recognizance. The judge adjusted her glasses, looking down at the papers in front of her. Given the nature of the charges and the defendant's lack of criminal history, I'll set bail at $25,000, next case. Malik's shoulders slumped. $25,000 might as well have been $1 million. He turned to David, his voice barely above a whisper. What happens now? David sighed. We'll try to get the bail reduced, but for now, you'll have to go back to holding. I'll talk to your family and see if we can arrange something. Malik nodded, though he felt like he was drowning. The officers led him out of the courtroom and back to the holding cell, where he spent the rest of the day staring at the walls, his mind racing. That evening, Malik's mom and sister came to visit him. Seeing them through the thick glass partition was both a relief and a painful reminder of everything he was losing. His mom's eyes were red from crying, and his sister, only 14, looked scared and confused. Malik, baby, what happened? His mom asked, her voice trembling. I didn't do anything wrong, Mom, Malik said, pressing his hand against the glass. I was trying to stop a fight, and the cops they arrested me instead of the kids who were actually fighting. His mom shook her head, tears streaming down her face. This isn't right. We're going to get you out of here, okay? We'll figure something out. Malik's sister, Mia, spoke up for the first time. Are you gonna be okay, Malik? He forced a smile, though it felt like his heart was breaking. Yeah, Mia. I'm gonna be okay. Just stay strong for me, all right? She nodded, but her lower lip quivered. Malik hated seeing her like this. He was supposed to protect her, to be someone she could look up to. Now he was stuck behind glass, powerless to do anything. The next few days passed in a blur. Malik's family managed to scrape together enough money for a bail bondsman, and he was released on the condition that he wear an ankle monitor and stay in the city until his trial. Coming home should have felt like a relief, but it didn't. Malik felt like a stranger in his own life. The ankle monitor was a constant reminder of the charges hanging over his head, and the looks he got from people in the neighborhood made him feel like a criminal. David worked tirelessly to prepare for the trial. He interviewed Malik's coworkers, neighbors, and anyone else who could vouch for his character. He also tried to track down the teenagers who had been involved in the fight, but they seemed to have disappeared. No one knew their names, and no one had come forward to say what had really happened. We're going to have to focus on discrediting the police report, David said during one of their meetings. The officers claim you were the aggressor, but we'll argue that their judgment was clouded by bias. It's not going to be easy, but it's our best shot. Malik nodded, though he felt like the odds were stacked against him. He'd seen enough news stories to know how these things usually went. The system wasn't built for people like him. The trial began 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed, with Malik's family and friends sitting in the front row. Malik sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He tried to stay calm, but his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his ears. The prosecutor called the arresting officer to the stand first. Officer Daniels was a tall man with a buzz cut and a no-nonsense attitude. He described the scene as he'd seen it. Malik in the middle of the street, shouting and swinging at the teenagers. He made it sound like Malik had been the one causing all the trouble. David stood up for cross-examination. Officer Daniels, did you actually see my client throw a punch? Officer Daniels hesitated. Not exactly, but, so you're assuming he was the aggressor based on what, exactly? Based on the situation, Officer Daniels said, his voice tight. He was the only one in the middle of the fight. But you didn't see him start it, did you? No, but, thank you, officer. No further questions. David's tone was calm, but Malik could see the frustration in his eyes. The prosecutor called a few more witnesses, including one of the teenager's parents, who claimed Malik had a history of causing trouble. Malik had never even met the woman, but her testimony made him sound like a menace. When it was David's turn to present the defense, he called Malik's coworkers and neighbors to the stand. They all testified to his good character, describing him as hardworking, respectful, and peaceful. But without anyone to contradict the police's version of events, it felt like an uphill battle. Finally, David called Malik to the stand. Malik's palms were sweaty as he swore to tell the truth, but he forced himself to focus. He told his story clearly and calmly, explaining how he'd tried to stop the fight and how the police had arrested him without even asking what had happened. The prosecutor stood up for cross-examination, a smug look on his face. "Mr. Johnson, isn't it true that you have a history of confrontations with authority figures?" Malik frowned. "No, that's not true." "Really? What about the incident last year where you were questioned by police at a protest?" "I wasn't arrested," Malik said, his voice steady. "I was exercising my right to free speech." The prosecutor smirked. "So you admit you have a history of being involved in volatile situations?" "Objection," David said, standing up. "The prosecution is mischaracterizing the facts." "Sustained," the judge said, giving the prosecutor a warning look. The prosecutor tried a few more times to trip Malik up, but Malik held his ground. By the time he stepped down from the stand, he felt like he'd done the best he could. As the trial dragged on, Malik's hope began to fade. The prosecutor painted him as a troublemaker, and the lack of witnesses to back up his story made it hard to fight back. David did his best, but it felt like they were fighting a losing battle. The day of the closing arguments arrived. The prosecutor stood first, his voice dripping with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case. The defendant was involved in a violent altercation, and the evidence shows that he was the aggressor. The police acted appropriately, and it's your duty to hold him accountable for his actions." David stood next, his tone calm but passionate. "This case isn't about what Malik Johnson did or didn't do. It's about a system that's quick to judge and slow to listen. Malik was trying to do the right thing, and he's being punished for it. Don't let injustice prevail." The jury deliberated for hours. Malik sat in the courtroom, his family by his side, waiting for the verdict. When the jury finally returned, his heart felt like it was going to beat out of his chest. The foreman stood. "We find the defendant not guilty." Malik's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. Then his family erupted into cheers, and David clapped him on the back. The judge dismissed the case, and Malik was free to go. But as he walked out of the courtroom, the weight of everything that had happened settled over him. He'd been lucky this time, but he knew the fight wasn't over. The system was still broken, and too many people like him weren't as lucky. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions for Malik. While he was relieved to have been found not guilty, the experience had left a deep scar. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been targeted because of the color of his skin, and the thought of how close he'd come to losing everything haunted him. His community rallied around him, organizing a small celebration to mark his victory, but Malik couldn't bring himself to feel like celebrating. He knew his case was just one of many, and not everyone was as fortunate as he had been. One evening, as Malik sat on the steps of his apartment building, his friend Jamal joined him. Jamal had been one of the few people who had stood by Malik throughout the trial, and Malik was grateful for his support. "You good, man?" Jamal asked, sitting down beside him. Malik sighed, staring out at the street. "I don't know. I just keep thinking about how things could have gone differently. If those kids hadn't shown up at the last minute, I'd be in jail right now." Jamal nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, but they did show up, and you're here. That's what matters." "But what about the next guy?" Malik asked, his voice tight with frustration. "What about the next black man who gets arrested for something he didn't do? What if no one speaks up for him?" Jamal didn't have an answer, and the two sat in silence for a while, the weight of Malik's words hanging in the air. Finally, Jamal spoke again. "You know, you've got a platform now. People listen to your story. Maybe you can use that to make a difference." Malik frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you could speak out. Share your experience. Help people understand what's really going on. You've got a voice, man. Use it." Malik thought about that for a long time. He'd never considered himself an activist or a leader, but Jamal was right. He had a story to tell, and maybe, just maybe, it could make a difference. A few weeks later, Malik was invited to speak at a community meeting about racial injustice. He was nervous at first, unsure of what to say or how to say it, but as he stood in front of the crowd, the words came pouring out. I'm not here because I'm special, he began, his voice steady. I'm here because I'm lucky. Lucky that those kids showed up in court. Lucky that I had a lawyer who believed in me. Lucky that the jury saw the truth. But what about the people who aren't so lucky? What about the ones who don't get a second chance? The room was silent, everyone hanging on his words. Malik took a deep breath and continued. This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about a system that's broken, that sees us as threats instead of people. And if we don't speak up, if we don't fight back, nothing's ever gonna change. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. People came up to him afterward, thanking him for sharing his story and telling him how much it meant to them. For the first time since the trial, Malik felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few months, Malik became more involved in his community. He joined a local organization that worked to combat racial injustice, sharing his story at rallies and meetings. He also started mentoring young kids in his neighborhood, teaching them how to stand up for themselves and each other. It wasn't easy. There were times when Malik felt overwhelmed, when the weight of everything he was fighting for threatened to crush him. But he kept going, fueled by the belief that change was possible. One day, as he was leaving a community center after a meeting, Malik ran into one of the teenagers from the fight. The kid, his name was Ryan, looked nervous, but he approached Malik anyway. Hey, Ryan said, shoving his hands in his pockets. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. Malik raised an eyebrow. You mean for not speaking up when the cops arrested me? Ryan nodded, his face red with shame. Yeah, I was scared, I didn't want to get in trouble, but what they did to you, it wasn't right? Malik studied him for a moment, then sighed. Yeah, it wasn't, but I appreciate you saying that. Ryan hesitated, then asked, Do you think there's anything I can do to make it right? Malik thought about it. You can start by speaking up next time. If you see something wrong, say something. Don't just stand by and let it happen. Ryan nodded, looking determined. I will. I promise. As time went on, Malik's story began to gain traction. Local news outlets picked it up, and soon, he was being interviewed on TV and radio shows. People from all over the country reached out to him, sharing their own stories of injustice and thanking him for giving them hope. But Malik never forgot where he came from. He continued to work in his community, organizing events and advocating for change. He also kept in touch with David, who had become a mentor and friend. One evening, as Malik was preparing for a speech at a national conference on racial justice, David called him. You're doing amazing work, Malik, David said. I'm really proud of you. Malik smiled. Thanks, David. I couldn't have done it without you. You're stronger than you think, David replied, and you're making a difference. Keep going. The day of the conference arrived, and Malik stood on stage in front of hundreds of people. He looked out at the crowd, his heart pounding, and began to speak. A year ago, I was just a regular guy trying to do the right thing, he said. I never thought I'd be standing here, talking to all of you. But what happened to me opened my eyes to the injustices that so many people face every day. And it made me realize that we can't just sit back and hope things will get better. We have to fight for change. The crowd erupted into applause, and Malik felt a surge of determination. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to face it. As Malik stepped off the stage, he was surrounded by people who wanted to shake his hand and thank him. Among them was a young black man who looked to be about Malik's age. Your story really inspired me, the man said. I've been through something similar, and hearing you speak, it gave me hope. Malik smiled and shook his hand. That's why I do this. To give people hope, and to remind them that they're not alone. The man nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you. As Malik left the conference that night, he felt a sense of purpose he'd never felt before. He knew the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. There were people all over the world who were fighting the same fight, and together, they could make a difference. Malik looked up at the stars, taking a deep breath. The road ahead would be long, but he was ready to walk it. And he knew that, no matter what happened, he would never stop fighting for what was right.
If you enjoyed this content, please leave a like and drop a comment below letting us know where you're listening from. It helps this channel grow more than you know. Have a nice day.